Hi everyone, welcome to a brief summary of week number 3. I'm going to try to give you some feedback for both the primary source discussion and also the larger week number 3 sample response so that you're better prepared for week number 4. And then at the end of this week, you have a week-long break before we resume in the first, after on July 6th is when we'll come back and start up class. So you have a week-long break after completing week number 4 before we jump into week number 5. So I figured hopefully you can get the opportunity to view this video, see some of the changes I recommend, and then be best prepared for week number 4 before we take a break and then implement even more growth in week number 5. So let's get started. First of all, everything for week number 4 is currently posted. You'll notice I've only recorded 2 lectures, lecture 1 and 2 for this week. And that's because you have a longer, about an hour-long documentary on the Industrial Revolution done by the BBC. I focus on the Industrial Revolution outside of where it began in Britain, and the BBC is going to tell you a whole bunch about the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. So you really need to make sure you check out that BBC documentary first before diving into lectures 1 and 2. Your primary source discussion asks you to comment on Karl Marx. I will open this up for just a moment because I want to point something out. A lot of us think, they hear Marx and they think communism and they think evil, and that's largely because of the influence of the Cold War, which began around 1945 and continued through the fall of the Berlin Wall in the late 1980s. But we have to remember that Karl Marx is writing all the way back in the 1840s, almost, more than 50 years before the beginning of the Red Revolution in the USSR or in Russia and then becoming the USSR. So Karl Marx, we have to take him on his own terms. We can't totally associate Marx with communism, dictatorship, and the Cold War because a lot of what happened in the USSR was actually totally antithetical or opposite to what Karl Marx had argued for. And for those of you who thinks that the United States, operates totally opposed to Marxism, that's not true. If you attended a public school, if you use the post office, if you enjoy the FDA, right, government programs, if you have Social Security, if you've ever drawn from Medicare or Medicaid, all of these programs are government-run programs that Marx would certainly give a thumbs up to and didn't exist prior to the 1930s and the New Deal when the United States started implementing what some would argue were slightly Marxist programs. So when we read Karl Marx, you really have to understand Marx on his own terms. So you're going to be reading an excerpt from Marx and Engels' famous The Communist Manifesto. And what I want you to do is we're not going to necessarily compare this with another reading like we normally do. Instead, my question asks you, what does Karl Marx mean when he says the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle? Who are the bourgeoisie, and what is Marx's problem with them? What is Marx's suggestion to fix the problem? And lastly, do you agree or disagree with him? I imagine that the response probably takes 2 to 3 paragraphs this time rather than just 1, and I figure that that's pretty fair considering you don't have to do another reading or there's no other juxtaposing piece to compare Marx with. Instead, I'm asking you to write a little bit more on Karl Marx. So this is your primary source discussion for the week, and if we go back, your week number 4 response is going to ask you a little bit about the Industrial Revolution that we've studied this week. And I'll just skip ahead to the question. The Industrial Revolution gave rise to a powerful economic, social, and political system known as capitalism. Although a thorough definition of capitalism is complex, a basic summary is as follows. It's an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. Now, some historians would argue that the rise of capitalism during the Industrial Revolution created an entirely new world order. Others, however, say the opposite. Capitalism only further reinforced systems of world power that had been built during the colonial era. In a response, explain whether you agree that capitalism created a new global order or whether you think capitalism only reinforced the old order. Be sure to use evidence from the text, the lecture, the primary source, the Marx reading could be a good source to use here, and the documentary, the BBC documentary, to support your answer. Now, I gave you a thorough, discussion of both the primary source and the response because, to be frank, I was a little disappointed with week number three's primary source discussion and week number three's response as a whole. And this is for two reasons. So I'm just going to go back for a minute. The first reason is because I can track the views and the clicks for the lectures 1, 2, 3, and 4 from last week, and it was far less than the number of students who are in this class. So for those of you who think you can kind of skip through the lectures, perhaps you've done that. Perhaps you haven't really watched the lectures, but you're still doing well in this class. I mean, more power to you. I guess you can continue with it, but it might come back to bite you at some point. But I could definitely tell that some people had not really watched all of our lectures, and even fewer had listened to the Reign of Terror podcast, also produced by the BBC. Your response for last week asked you why you thought, in your opinion, that there was no reign of terror during the American Revolution, like there was in the French Revolution. Our entire last chapter was about comparing revolutions during the Age of Revolutions. And I think only one of you, perhaps two, drew a direct connection to the Reign of Terror podcast. And if you didn't, I've got to ask you why, because it seems to be the best point of reference for a question about the Reign of Terror. That is, if we're answering a question about the Reign of Terror, why aren't we making a reference to the podcast that's about that exact thing? Unless, of course, we're simply not doing it. So for this week, I would highly recommend that everyone does everything that's expected of you. There's no extra credit offered in this class other than what's already been assigned. So if you find yourself falling behind, we're halfway through the class at the end of week 4. You've really got to pick it up on your own terms. So if you're someone who says, oh man, yeah, I really need to improve, what can you do? Every week I try to give you a sample response from a student who did a good job. And so I want to open week number 3's sample response here to talk a little bit about it. And I've already downloaded it as a PDF, so I can just pull it up right here. And I want you to notice one thing. First of all, as is the case with most of the other weekly responses, they didn't necessarily earn 10 out of 10, 100%. There were things that could be better about all of them. Some of them did earn 10 out of 10, but not all of them. There could be things that could be improved. I really liked this response for a couple of reasons. However, I also chose this response because the student who created this response did the same thing that almost everyone else in the class did. And that was, they wrote me somewhat of a mystery essay. That is, you'll notice on your rubric, one of the most important parts in a response is having a thesis. Now, some of you are sitting there and being like, well, how can I have a thesis? It's actually quite easy. Our response this week asked you a question, right? In week number 3, there was a specific question. Why was there no reign of terror during the American Revolution like there was during the French Revolution? Now, you'll notice that this answer says, this tension caused a global event that rocked the world a few decades ago called the Reign of Terror, but there was no Reign of Terror in the American Revolution. Now, the Reign of Terror was, of course, a couple of centuries ago, right? And but this student does rightly note that they're going to get to the difference between the French Revolution and the American Revolution. And you'll notice that then the format of the essay is a paragraph about the American Revolution, a paragraph about the French Revolution and how it was different, and then an answer that comes here. The American Revolution and the French Revolution ended in war, but the American Revolution did not have a reign of terror, right? And it goes on to explain, if you went back and you read the differences in these first two paragraphs, why that was. So this response, although it's quite good, especially because it draws from the textbook in really good ways, and you'll see all the citations here that are really good quotes that explain the differences between the American and the French Revolution, but it didn't earn a 10 out of 10 because, like almost every other answer this week, it didn't give me an explicit thesis in the introduction, right? The best way to answer a question in a response, in an essay, in a paper, is to give your reader a very concise answer in the introduction. Now, for those of you who are working on paper number 1, this is critical. In paper number 1, I'm asking you how 3 different anti-slavery writers framed abolition in different ways. So while I am asking you to summarize what these 3 writers said, Most importantly, I'm asking you for your own original analysis, just like I asked you in this response paper, right? This response paper asked you for your original analysis. Historians debate why the American Revolution had no reign of terror. And the best answers like this one and a couple others told me it's because probably the French Revolution was a social revolution from the ground up, right? All the major institutions, whether they be the tax system, the Catholic Church, the political system, right? Monarchy entirely, they were all overthrown. Every part of French society, as the podcast tells us quite clearly, was brought up for some sort of overturning. The American Revolution wasn't really like that. A bunch of you noted the American Revolution got rid of the English, got rid of the British crown, but it didn't change much else. And in fact, when the Americans created their new government, it looked a lot like Great Britain's. It just didn't have a king. And that's why Strayer in the textbook notes that when compared to either the French or the Haitian Revolution or the Latin American revolutions, the American Revolution looks pretty conservative. It's not nearly as radical as the French Revolution. And to bring this back to the primary source, I try to connect everything, right? Your primary source discussion asked you to discuss Edmund Burke. And a lot of you, and Edmund Burke was, a lot of you has noted, was an Englishman who observed the French Revolution, and he despised it. He said, oh yeah, the French, here we go, the reflecting on the French Revolution, right? Edmund Burke, he was an Englishman who thought that, yeah, there should be revolution, but the French have gone about it all wrong. And as a lot of you noted, Edmund Burke was actually in favor of the American Revolution. So a good answer there told me that Edmund Burke, although he supported the American Revolution, opposed the French Revolution because it was too radical, right? It relied on radical republicanism, which republicanism, small r, right? No connection to the Republican Party in the United States. Republicanism is the rule of law, and it normally relies on the popular opinion of many. And the French Revolution tried to bring a radical version of republicanism to France almost overnight. And so a lot of you noted that Burke was like, yeah, absolutely, the king has to go. The Catholic Church is too powerful. But he said there has to be a line drawn. We can't just overturn all parts of French society. And in a lot of ways, the Americans in their revolution recognized that as well. And some of you got to that in the week number 3 sample response. So take a look at the sample response I provided. Like I said, it's not perfect, but it certainly gets across a really good model for you all to follow. And remember, the most important thing as we move into week number 4, because your question asked you again, your response question, asked you about whether you think that the Industrial Revolution created a new capitalist world order or whether it reinforced an older world order. In your thesis, you need to explain what your answer is. Was it a new world order or was it an old world order, and why, right? A quick summary of why. And then your body paragraphs explain why you think that way. That's how a proper response should work. And for the paper, that's pivotal. If you don't give a brief synopsis for your reader in the introduction of your thesis and what you're going to say to support that thesis, you're not doing the paper the right way. Outlining is key. Make sure you have the answer for your reader early. A lot of you, I noted, don't write a mystery novel. Your reader should know from the beginning what it is you're saying and how you are going to say it. And I want to throw a quick little line in here, possible extra credit. If you've made it this far, what I want you to do at the end of week number 4's response, at the very end, skip a couple of lines and just type for me, I finished the weekly recap video. Put a period at the end of that. I'll tack on some extra points to all the week number 4 responses that do that as evidence to me that you completed this weekly recap video. If you have any questions, please make sure to get them to me sooner rather than later. Begin and continue to work on paper number 1. Remember, I extended the deadline. Go back to the modules here and you can find the paper number 1 module. I've got an explanation video. I've got the 3 sources you're using. Remember, most importantly, I'm not looking for summary. Don't summarize Sewell, Wilberforce, and Douglas and say the end. I want original analysis. That's what historians do. Tell me how 3 anti-slavery writers talked about abolition in different ways. Make up your own arguments. I look forward to reading week number 4 and the